The year was 2347, and humanity had known about the galactic hegemony of United Systems for almost 100 years now, but Earth had never once accepted their invitations to join, not a single time, and the Empire had long since stopped asking. To the 40,000 star systems that made up the Empire, Earth was a joke, a single lonely planet circling a boring yellow star at the edge of the galaxy, populated by soft little creatures who had somehow figured out basic space travel, but refused to do anything useful with it, and the Empire had better things to do than worry about one stubborn species that wanted to be left alone. That was their first mistake. The Valori Directorate was one of the most powerful vassal blocks inside the Empire, and they controlled the mining rights for nearly a quarter of the galactic arm. And when their long-range scanners picked up rich deposits of helium-3 on Titan and rare metals buried deep inside Ceres, they did not bother to ask permission from anyone on Earth. Because why would they? Because Earth was nothing. Because humans were nothing. And the Valori had 200 warships and the legal backing of imperial trade law on their side. So they came. 200 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel just beyond the orbit of Jupiter, and immediately began deploying automated mining platforms toward Titan and Ceres, without so much as a greeting. And the ships were enormous things, covered in shimmering energy shields, with weapons batteries that could crack a moon in half, and their crews looked out at the tiny blue planet in the distance, and felt nothing but boredom. On Earth the alerts came fast, and the Unified Defense Council gathered in their underground chamber beneath the Swiss Alps within the hour, and the room was full of the most powerful military and civilian leaders on the planet, and every single one of them was calm, not because they were not concerned, but because they had been planning for this exact moment for 80 years. Admiral Rena Cordova stood at the center of the room, a tall woman with silver-streaked black hair and dark, steady eyes that never seemed to blink when she was thinking. And she had commanded the First Fleet for 12 years, and had spent her entire career preparing for a day she hoped would never come, but always knew would. The president of the Unified Council, a quiet man named Adrian Mwangi, looked at her from across the table and said just 4 words. "One warning, Admiral, one." Cordova nodded because she understood perfectly, and this had always been the plan. Not 2 warnings, not negotiations, not a series of escalating diplomatic notes that would be ignored and laughed at. Just one single message, delivered one single time. And if it was not respected, then the next communication would not be made with words. She walked to the command console and opened a channel, not just to the Valori fleet, to every single diplomatic relay node in the known galaxy, every embassy, every news network, every listening post, and she broadcast it in the clear, with no encryption, in every known galactic language. And her voice was calm and even and carried no anger at all, which somehow made it worse. "You are in sovereign human space. You are not invited. You have not asked. You will leave within 1 standard rotation, or you will be removed. This message will not be repeated." That was it. No threats of what would happen, no descriptions of weapons, no bluster or posturing. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same tone a person might use to read a grocery list. And then she closed the channel and sat down. Aboard the Valori flagship, the Undying Blade, Archon Tael Sorvan listened to the message, and then laughed so hard that his second-in-command thought he might choke. And Sorvan was a veteran of 30 campaigns against species far more impressive than humans. And he had 200 warships bristling with enough firepower to glass an entire continent. And the idea that this little backwater planet was threatening him was the funniest thing he had heard in decades. He composed a reply, and made sure it was also broadcast on open channels, so the entire galaxy could enjoy the joke. "How quaint," he said. "The primates have learned to use a microphone. We will take what we need and leave when we are finished. And if your tiny fleet of rust buckets comes anywhere near my ships, I will use them for target practice." Across the Empire, the exchange was broadcast on news networks and entertainment channels, and it played exactly the way the Vialori expected. Species after species laughed at the humans and their ridiculous ultimatum. And commentators made jokes about the primitive single-system species that thought it could stand up to an empire that had ruled the stars for 6,000 years. And for a full day, the Sol system was the biggest joke in the galaxy. On Earth, nobody laughed, and nobody panicked, and nobody did anything at all that looked like fear. And Admiral Cordova sat in her command chair aboard the orbital station Sentinel and watched the clock count down with the same calm expression she always wore. And when her aide asked her if she was worried, she looked at him and said something he would remember for the rest of his life. "I am not worried. I am disappointed. I wanted them to leave. I wanted them to be smart enough to leave." Deep beneath the surface of Earth's moon, in a facility that had no name on any official record and did not exist on any map, a technician named Yuki Tanaka watched as row after row of status lights shifted from amber to green, thousands of them, stretching down a corridor that seemed to go on forever, and each light represented a weapon system that the galaxy did not know existed, that no one, outside the most classified levels of the UDC, had ever seen or even talked. Imagined. She picked up her communicator and sent a single text confirmation to Admiral Cordova. Just 3 words. Prometheus Array Online. Cordova read the message and closed her eyes for just a moment, and when she opened them again, they were harder than before. And she looked at the tactical display showing 200 Valori warships sitting fat and happy in her solar system like they owned it. And she felt something that was not anger and not fear, but was something much older and much colder than both. The countdown continued. The Valori kept mining, and the entire solar system held its breath. The deadline came and went, like a quiet heartbeat in the dark. Admiral Rena Cordova watched the clock tick past 0 and felt nothing at all. No satisfaction, no regret. Just the cold, steady weight of a decision that had already been made a long time ago by people who knew this day would come, and all she had to do now was say the words. She opened a secure channel to Lunar Command and spoke 2 words. Closed fist. There was no dramatic pause, no moment of hesitation, no speech about the gravity of what was about to happen, because speeches were for people who needed convincing, and Cordova did not need convincing, and neither did anyone else in the chain of command. They had drilled this scenario 1,000 times, and every person knew their role, and every system was already in position and had been in position for decades. What happened next took exactly 11 minutes. Across the solar system, things that had looked like rocks began to move. Things that had looked like dead satellites began to wake up. And things that had been drifting silently in the asteroid belt for 50 years suddenly revealed themselves to be something else entirely. And the Valori never saw any of it, because they were not looking for it. Because it had never occurred to them that an entire solar system could be a weapon. The Prometheus Array was not one weapon, but thousands of them, woven into the very structure of the Sol system itself, hidden inside asteroids, and buried beneath the surfaces of moons, and disguised as space junk and orbital debris. And it had been built over 80 years by generations of engineers and scientists who had worked in total secrecy, knowing that they were building something that might never be used, but had to exist anyway, because that was what humans did. They prepared for the worst while hoping for the best, and they never ever assumed that hope alone would be enough. The first wave was kinetic. Impactors launched from hidden platforms in the asteroid belt that crossed the distance to the Valori fleet in seconds, each one a tungsten rod no bigger than a telephone pole, traveling at a fraction of the speed of light. And at those speeds, a simple metal rod carried more energy than a nuclear warhead, and they hit the Valori ships before the ships even registered them on sensors. The second wave was the drone swarms, millions of tiny AI-guided machines that had been sleeping inside hollowed-out rocks near Jupiter and Saturn. And they poured out like silver rivers and descended on the Valori fleet from every direction at once, each one too small to target individually, but carrying enough shaped charges to punch through hull plating. And they swarmed the ships like insects eating a carcass. The third wave was the directed energy platforms hidden on the dark sides of a dozen moons. Massive weapons that fired beams of focused energy that cut through Valori shields like they were not even there, because the humans had spent decades studying captured alien probes, and they knew exactly what frequencies the shields operated on, and had built weapons specifically designed to bypass them. They had spent 11 minutes planning this. That was all it took. 200 warships of the Valori Directorate, each one a masterpiece of imperial engineering, crewed by veterans of dozens of campaigns, were reduced to expanding clouds of hot metal and frozen atmosphere drifting silently through the void. And not a single human ship had fired a shot, not one, because the ships had not needed to move at all, because the entire solar system had done the fighting for them. But not every ship was destroyed. The flagship Undying Blade still existed, though it would never move again under its own power. And this was deliberate. This was the part of the plan that mattered most, because killing the fleet was a message, but leaving the flagship alive was a different kind of message. Entirely. Every system on the Undying Blade was dead, except for communications, and even those were locked to receive only. And Archon Sorvon stood on his darkened bridge, surrounded by the silence of a ship that had become his coffin, and stared at screens that no longer responded to his commands. And for the first time in his long career, he felt something he did not recognize at first, because he had never felt it before. And it took him a moment to understand that it was genuine terror. Then his screens lit up. Not with a threat, not with a demand for surrender, not with gloating or celebration, but with data, pure, clean, organized data. And as Sorvon read it, his terror deepened into something worse, because the data was a complete technical readout of every ship in his fleet, their classified shield frequencies and reactor specifications, and structural weaknesses, and crew manifests down to individual names and medical records. All of it perfect, all of it accurate, of it. Information that should have been impossible for any outsider to possess. The message was clear, without a single word being spoken. We knew everything about you before you arrived. We knew your shields and your weapons and your crews and your tactics. We knew all of it. And we let you come anyway, because we wanted you to see what happens when you ignore our warning. Across the galaxy, the laughter died in throats, and smiles fell from faces, and the entertainment channels went silent one by one as the news spread, and it spread fast, because Cordova had made sure of that. She had transmitted the battle data on every open channel, so that every species in every system could see exactly what had happened and exactly how long it had taken. 11 minutes. That number echoed through the halls of power on 1,000 worlds, and it kept diplomats awake at night, and made admirals stare at their own fleet deployments with new and uncomfortable eyes. The Galactic Security Council called an emergency session for the first time in 400 years. And the chamber was full and the voices were loud, but beneath all the shouting, there was a new sound that had not been heard in the halls of the Empire for 6,000 years. It was the sound of uncertainty. On Earth, Admiral Cordova finally allowed herself to sit back in her chair, and she closed her eyes and breathed out slowly. And her aide brought her a cup of coffee, and she held it in both hands and felt its warmth. And for just a moment, she let herself feel the weight of what she had done. 200 ships and all their crews gone in 11 minutes. And she was not proud of it, but she was not ashamed of it either, because they had been warned, and they had chosen not to listen, and that choice had consequences. She took a sip of her coffee, and opened her eyes and looked at the tactical display, now cleared of red markers, and she said quietly to no one in particular, "We told them, and they did not listen. They never listen. And somewhere on the crippled undying blade, Archon Sorvon sat alone in the dark and stared at the data on his screen, and understood at last that everything he had believed about humans was wrong. And the thing that frightened him most was not what they had done, but how easily they had done it, as if this was not their full strength, as if this was just what they were willing to show. He was right to be frightened. It was not even close to their full strength. The imperial capital of Cythera Prime was a world of glass towers and floating gardens and gentle seas that had not known war in 3,000 years. And in its great council chamber, the rulers of 40,000 star systems were screaming at each other like children fighting over a broken toy. The Arcanate Council was in emergency session and had been for 6 days straight, and nobody had slept properly, and nobody could agree on anything, except that what had happened in the Sol system was impossible. And yet it had happened anyway, and that made everything worse. Archon Prime Delessa Vaughn sat at the head of the great curved table and listened to her council tear itself apart, and she felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. She was tired because she had ruled the Empire for 40 years, and in all that time, she had never once faced a problem she could not solve with either diplomacy or overwhelming force, and now she was facing something that might not respond to either. The Hawks wanted blood, led by the Vavori delegation, whose faces were twisted with humiliation and rage, and they demanded that the Grand Fleet be assembled and sent to Sol immediately, to burn Earth to ashes and scatter humanity across the void, as a warning to any other species that might get ideas about standing up to the Empire. The Doves wanted caution, led by the older species who had been part of the Empire long enough to have seen overconfidence destroy civilizations before, and they pointed out that the humans had wiped out 200 warships in 11 minutes without losing a single soldier, and that maybe, just maybe, charging into their home system was not the smartest plan anyone had ever come up with. And then there was Strategos Kale Viren. Viren was the Empire's chief intelligence analyst, a tall, thin being from a species called the Tesserae, whose 4 silver eyes could read micro-expressions across species barriers. Been given one job in the weeks since the Sol incident: build a complete threat profile on humanity. Find out who they really were and what they were truly capable of, and whether the Empire could win a war against them. He had spent those weeks buried in every scrap of data the Empire had ever collected on humans, and he had read their history, and studied their culture, and analyzed their wars and their art and their literature and their science, and what he had found had not helped him sleep at all. When the council finally gave him the floor, the room went quiet, because everyone knew that Viren did not speak unless he had something important to say. And he stood at the center of that great chamber, and looked at the most powerful beings in the galaxy, and he began to talk about Earth. He told them about the Ice Ages, about how humans had survived not one, but several periods when their entire planet tried to freeze them to death, and they had refused to die, wrapping their shelters in fur and stone and ice, and they had refused to die, themselves in animal skins, and hunting mammoths with pointed sticks, and somehow making it through. He told them about the plagues, about diseases that killed half their population, and how the survivors buried their dead and kept going, and eventually learned to fight the invisible things that were killing them, and won. He told them about the wars, and this was the part that made the council go very still, because Viren explained that humans had not just fought wars against other species or external threats. They had fought wars against each other, with a frequency and ferocity that had no parallel anywhere in the galactic record. And they had invented weapons specifically designed to kill other humans in larger and larger numbers, until they had built bombs that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light. And then they had built enough of those bombs to destroy their own planet several times over. And then they had not used them. That was the part Viren said scared him the most. Not the humans had built weapons of total destruction, but that they had built them and then chosen not to use them, because that meant they understood restraint, and restraint combined with the capacity for overwhelming violence was the most dangerous combination any intelligence analyst could imagine. He told them about how every other species in the Empire had been discovered and guided into civilization by elder races, given technology and knowledge and protection during their vulnerable early years. But humans had received none of that. They had crawled up out of the mud entirely alone, on a planet that seemed designed to kill them, fighting every step of the way against predators and diseases and natural disasters, and each other. And they had not just survived, but thrived. He told them that human children played games that simulated war, that their most popular stories were about conflict and survival, that their scientists had split the atom and their engineers had built machines that could reshape worlds. And their first thought had been to build a weapon with it, and that their entire civilization was built on a foundation of competitive adaptation that made them fundamentally different from every other intelligent species the Empire had ever encountered. And then he delivered his conclusion, and the room was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the air recyclers. They did not build their weapons because they saw us coming, Viren said, and his 4 silver eyes swept across the chamber. They built them because they always assumed something would come. We are not facing a civilization that reacted to a threat. We are facing a civilization that is in its very nature a prepared response to the universe itself. The silence that followed lasted a long time. On the neutral trading station of Meridian Hub, Ambassador Ilia Vasquez sat in her small office and drank tea, and watched the galactic news feeds with an expression of calm patience that drove everyone, journalist and diplomat, who tried to interview her absolutely insane, because she would not explain what had happened. She would not describe the weapons. She would not make threats or demands or even raise her voice. When the most famous journalist in the Empire cornered her in a corridor and demanded to know what humanity wanted, Vasquez looked at her with warm brown eyes and said simply, "We want to be left alone. That is what we have always wanted. We told you this. We told everyone this, and we meant it." The journalist asked what would happen if the Empire did not leave them alone. Vasquez smiled, and it was a kind smile, with no malice in it at all, and she said, "We already showed you what happens, and that was us being gentle." Back on Sethera Prime, the Hawks won the vote, barely, and the resolution passed. The Grand Fleet would be assembled. 15,000 warships from every corner of the Empire, the largest military force ever gathered in. Recorded galactic history, and it would go to Sol, and it would force humanity to submit. When word reached Ambassador Vasquez through encrypted channels, she sat quietly for a moment and then composed a single message to Earth. They did not listen. On Earth, the message was received by Admiral Cordova, who read it and nodded, and felt that same cold disappointment she had felt before. And she passed it up the chain to President Mwangi, who read it and sighed, and authorized the next phase of preparations. And across the solar system, systems that had gone back to sleep began to wake up again, and new systems that had not yet been revealed began their startup sequences. Nobody on Earth panicked, because panic was not something humans did when they were threatened. What humans did when they were threatened was something much more dangerous than panic. The Grand Fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system, like a wall of metal and fire, stretching across the blackness of space. 15,000 warships drawn from every species and every sector of the Empire. And the light of their engines was so bright that amateur astronomers on Earth could see the glow with their naked eyes when they looked up at the night sky. Grand Admiral Savethra Null stood on the bridge of her command dreadnought, the Eternal Verdict, and looked at the tactical display showing the quiet yellow star ahead of her and the tiny blue planet orbiting it. And she did not make the mistake of underestimating what she saw, because unlike Archon Sorvan, she was not a fool. and she had studied what happened to the Valori fleet with the obsessive focus of someone who intended to survive. She had adapted. She had spread her fleet wide in a defensive formation that covered millions of kilometers, with layered shields and overlapping sensor coverage and redundant communication networks, and every ship was on full alert, with weapons charged and crews at battle stations. And she had brought electronic warfare specialists, and counter-drone systems, and shield harmonics that cycled randomly to prevent frequency targeting. She had done everything right, and she knew it. And she also knew deep in her gut that it probably would not be enough. But she had her orders, and she was a soldier, and she would carry them out. The Grand Fleet held position just outside the heliopause, the invisible boundary where the solar wind gave way to interstellar space, and they waited, and nothing happened. And the silence was somehow worse than any weapon. On Earth, Admiral Cordova watched the massive fleet on her displays, and felt a heaviness in her chest that she recognized as grief. Grief for what was about to happen if these people did not turn around. Grief for the lives that would end because powerful beings in distant chambers had chosen pride over wisdom. Page 5. President Mwangi stood beside her, and he looked older than he had looked a month ago. And he asked her quietly if there was any chance they would leave on their own. Cordova shook her head. Mwangi closed his eyes for a moment, and then he authorized the next step. Not a weapon this time. Not yet. Something else first. One more chance. One final attempt to make them understand. Aboard the Eternal Verdict, every screen on the bridge suddenly went white. Grand Admiral Knowles spun toward her communications officer and demanded to know what was happening, but the officer was staring at his console with an expression of pure disbelief, because the same thing was happening on every ship in the fleet. Every screen on every vessel, 15,000 warships worth of displays, all simultaneously hijacked, cutting through every firewall and every encryption and every security protocol as though they were made of paper. And then the broadcast began. Weapon, and it was not a threat. It was a story, the story of humanity told in images and sound and emotion. And it played on every screen in the Grand Fleet for 30 minutes, and no one could turn it off, and no one tried to after the first few seconds, because they could not look away. It showed humans huddled in caves while glaciers ground across the world above them. Small frightened creatures with nothing but fire and sharpened stones, trying to survive a planet that wanted them dead. It showed the first cities rising from river valleys, and then it showed those cities burning in wars fought with swords and spears, and then being rebuilt, and then burning again, and then being rebuilt again, over and over, a cycle of destruction and creation that never stopped. It showed the plagues, bodies piled in streets and mass graves and weeping survivors, and then it showed the survivors picking up their tools and starting over, and eventually learning to defeat the diseases that had nearly wiped them out. It showed the wars growing larger and more terrible, trenches filled with mud and poison gas, cities flattened by bombs dropped from aircraft, a blinding flash of light over a place called Hiroshima that killed 100,000 people in a single moment. And then the long, terrible standoff that followed, when both sides had enough of those weapons to end all life on Earth. And they stood at that edge for decades with their fingers on the button, and somehow did not press it. It showed the environmental collapse when they nearly choked their own planet to death with pollution and greed. And it showed them pulling back from that edge too, slowly and painfully and with great sacrifice, choosing to save their world when it would have been easier to let it die. And then the images changed. It showed Earth as it was now, green and blue and beautiful, oceans teeming with life, and forests covering continents, and cities that gleamed with clean energy. A world that had been broken and poisoned and nearly destroyed a dozen times over, and had been healed every single time by the same stubborn species that had broken it. The final image was Earth seen from space, a pale blue marble hanging in the darkness, and beneath it were words in every galactic language. "We did this to ourselves and survived. What makes you think you could do worse?" The screens went dark, and the bridge of the eternal verdict was silent, and Grand Admiral Knoll realized that her hands were shaking, and she gripped the railing in front of her until her knuckles went white, and she forced herself to breathe. She was a professional, and she had a job to do, and she could not let a film change her mind, no matter how powerful it was. So she ordered a probing attack. 50 of her fastest cruisers sent across the heliopause at maximum speed to test the human defenses and gather data. The 50 cruisers crossed the line. For 10 seconds, nothing happened, and the bridge crew of every ship in the fleet held their breath. Then all 50 cruisers ceased to exist. There was no battle, no exchange of fire, no warning shots, just 50 ships that were there and then were not, erased from reality so quickly that their destruction did not even register on sensors until after it was already over. And then something appeared in the Grand Fleet's Central Command network, something that should not have been possible, because the network was air-gapped and shielded and encrypted with the most advanced security the Empire possessed. But there it was anyway, delivered as casually as someone sliding a note under a door. It was a simulation. A complete, detailed tactical simulation showing exactly how the Grand Fleet would be destroyed if it crossed the heliopause. Every ship accounted for, every attack vector mapped, every defensive response anticipated and countered, with individual ship casualties listed by name and a projected timeline from first engagement to total annihilation. 4 hours. The simulation said it would take 4 hours to destroy 15,000 warships, and it presented this information with the calm precision of an engineering report. No emotion, no drama, just mathematics and physics and the quiet certainty of a species that had already done the calculations and was simply sharing the results. Grand Admiral Knoll stared at that simulation for a very long time. She thought about her career and her duty and the orders she had been given by the Arcanate Council. And then she thought about the 50 cruisers that had just vanished like sparks in the wind. And she thought about the Valori fleet that had died in 11 minutes. And she thought about that documentary and the species that had survived ice ages and plagues and nuclear weapons and themselves. She opened a channel to Sethara Prime and spoke directly to the Arcanate Council, and her voice was steady, even though something inside her was not. "I will not take this fleet across that line. Relieve me if you wish." The council chamber erupted in outrage and threats and demands, but Knoll simply waited, with her hands folded behind her back. And one by one the voices fell silent, because every single council member was looking at that same simulation on their own screens, and every single one of them was doing the math and arriving at the same conclusion. Nobody relieved her. Nobody ordered the fleet forward. Nobody said anything at all for a very long time. And then into that silence came a transmission from Earth, an open broadcast on all frequencies, and it was Ambassador Vasquez's voice, and it was warm and friendly, and carried not a trace of triumph or mockery. "We have coffee, if you would prefer to talk." Grand Admiral Knoll closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for weeks. And despite everything, that night, despite the fear and the tension and the 50 crews she had just lost, she almost smiled. The neutral station of Helix Veruna hung in the empty space between two dead stars, where no empire had ever claimed territory, and no species had ever built a home, and it existed for one purpose only: to be a place where enemies could sit across from each other and talk without weapons. And in its 300 years of existence, it had hosted negotiations that ended wars and prevented genocides and redrawn the maps of entire star sectors. But it had never hosted anything like this. The human delegation arrived in a single ship, a small, sleek vessel that docked quietly at the station without ceremony or escort. And when the airlock opened, Only 7 people walked out, led by Ambassador Ilya Vasquez, who wore a simple dark suit and carried nothing but a data tablet and a thermos of coffee. The Empire's delegation filled an entire wing of the station, over 100 representatives from dozens of species, accompanied by advisors and translators and security personnel, and legal scholars, and they had brought enough staff to run a small government. And the contrast between the two groups was so striking that it became the most talked-about image in the galaxy for months afterward. 7 humans on one side of the table, the weight of 40,000 star systems on the other. And somehow the 7 humans did not look small. Vasquez took her seat at the center of the human delegation and poured herself a cup of coffee from her thermos, and took a slow sip, and then looked up at the assembled might of the Galactic Empire, and smiled the way a person smiles at new neighbors who have come over to introduce themselves. Archon Prime Delessa Vaughn sat directly across from her and studied the human woman with ancient, careful eyes, because Vaughn had ruled the Empire for 4 decades, and she had negotiated with conquerors and tyrants and madmen, and she could usually read the intentions of any species within the first few seconds of meeting them. But Vasquez was different. Vasquez was warm and open and completely relaxed, and Vaughn could not find the threat in her anywhere, which was itself the most threatening thing of all. The negotiations began, and the galaxy held its breath, waiting to hear what demands humanity would make, what territories they would claim, what tribute they would extract, what humiliations they would impose on the Empire that had dared to trespass in their space. Because that was how power worked in the galaxy. You demonstrated strength, and then you used it to take things from those who were weaker. Vasquez laid out humanity's terms, and the room went completely silent. Earth wanted 3 things. First, formal recognition of human sovereignty over the Sol system, and nothing more. No buffer zones, no claimed territories, no expansion. Just their one star and its planets acknowledged as theirs. Second, a mutual non-aggression pact with every member state of the Empire. Promise that neither side would attack the other. Equal in both directions, binding on humans just as much as on the Empire. Third, an open trade agreement on equal terms. Not favorable terms, not exploitative terms, just the same deal that any other independent system would get. Nothing more and nothing less. That was it. The Imperial delegation sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute, because they had prepared for demands that would reshape the galactic order. And instead, they had received terms so reasonable that any junior diplomat could have drafted them in an afternoon. Strategos Kale Varen was present as a security advisor, and he sat in the back of the room and watched Vasquez with his 4 silver eyes, and in that moment he finally understood something about humans that all his research and analysis had only hinted at. And it was the key to everything, the answer to the question that had kept him awake for months. Humans did not want to conquer anyone. They never had. That was not what they were. What they were was something the galaxy had never encountered before. A species that asked for nothing except to be left alone, and was willing to deploy unlimited force to defend that single simple wish. Not to expand, not to dominate, not to rule, just to exist on their own terms, in their own space, without anyone telling them otherwise. They were not predators. They were the most dangerous kind of prey, the kind that had evolved so many defenses that attacking them was suicide. And all they wanted was for everyone else to understand that and act accordingly. The treaty took 3 days to finalize, and during those 3 days, something remarkable happened. The human delegates mingled with the Imperial representatives during breaks and meals, and they were friendly and funny and curious and generous. They shared their coffee and told jokes and asked questions about other species and their cultures with genuine interest. More than one Imperial diplomat found themselves liking the humans, despite being terrified of what they represented. On the final evening before the signing, Grand Admiral Saavedra Noel found herself alone with Ambassador Vasquez on an observation deck overlooking the stars, and the two women stood side by side in comfortable silence for a while, before Noel asked the question that had been eating at her since the standoff. "The simulation you sent us, the one showing how our fleet would be destroyed, was it accurate?" Vasquez turned to look at her, and her expression was kind, but her eyes held something deep and old and unreadable. "It was optimistic," she said, "in your favor." Noel felt something cold move through her chest, and she nodded slowly and looked back out at the stars, and she did not sleep well for a long time after that conversation. The treaty was signed the next morning in a ceremony broadcast to every system in the Empire, and Vasquez and Vaughn pressed their hands together in a gesture of peace that became one of the most famous images in galactic history. And the document they signed became known as the Sol Accords. In the years that followed, humanity became the strangest and most valued partner the Empire had ever known. They traded generously and shared technology freely, and their scientists collaborated with Imperial researchers on projects that advanced the understanding of physics and medicine and engineering by centuries. And human artists and musicians and writers enriched galactic culture in ways nobody had predicted. And human diplomats became known for their fairness and creativity in resolving disputes between other species. They never threatened anyone, not once. They never built warships beyond their own system. They never claimed a single rock outside the heliopause. They never used their power for anything except the one thing they had always used it for: making sure nobody forgot to leave them alone. And nobody did forget, not ever, because the memory of what had happened to the Velore fleet and the image of 15,000 warships stopped cold at the heliopause, and the quiet, calm voice of a woman saying, "This message will not be repeated," had burned itself into the collective consciousness of the galaxy like a brand. And it passed from generation to generation as a lesson that every species taught their young. Decades later, on an Imperial Academy world, a young alien student sat in a history class and raised their hand and asked a question that students had been asking since the Sol Accords were signed. Why did the Empire never try again? We had 15,000 ships, we had the resources of 40,000 systems. Why did we just accept their terms? The professor was old, a Velore who had served on a supply ship attached to the original fleet that had entered Sol. And he had lost friends in those 11 minutes, and he carried that weight every day. And when the student asked the question, he stopped writing on the display board and stood very still for a long moment. The classroom was quiet. The professor turned around and looked at the young faces staring up at him, and he thought about everything he had learned about humans in the decades since that day. All the kindness and generosity and warmth they had shown the galaxy, and all the terrifying capability that lay beneath it, like bedrock beneath a garden. "Because they meant it," he said, and his voice was soft. "Every word, every time. That is the most terrifying thing about humans. They always, always mean it." The student nodded slowly and wrote it down, and the professor turned back to the board, but he did not write anything for a while, because his hand was not quite steady. Outside the academy windows, the stars burned cold and bright, and among them somewhere was a small yellow sun circling a small blue planet where a species of former apes went about their daily lives, raising their children and building their future and drinking their coffee and laughing at their own jokes, peaceful and kind and generous and warm and ready, always ready, because that was the message they had sent to the galaxy, not with their weapons and not with their fleets, but with everything they were and everything they had ever been, a message carved into the bones of a species that had survived everything the universe had thrown at them, and had come out the other side, still standing, still building, still hoping. Humanity only warns you once, and the galaxy never forgot it.